to Books Kinokuniya for our National Bookshop Day celebration. What a great turnout. We're so pleased to have you all here. Those of you who have snared a seat will have a bag containing this book, Save Oz Stories. It has pieces exploring the many issues surrounding the proposals to repeal the Parallel Importation Restrictions in Australia. Those of you who are standing can pick up a copy from the cashiers. They should still have some left. I highly recommend it. So chairing our panel today, the CEO of Harper Collins Australia, James Kellow. Please join me in making him welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Helene, and thanks to Kinokuniya for hosting today's event. As Helene says, I'm James Kellow. I'm the CEO of Harper Collins Australia and New Zealand, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion on National Bookshop Day, the day we celebrate our love for our local bookstores. So thank you all for coming out. So we're here to discuss Australian books. Are they worth fighting for? We'll be focusing on the recent proposals to repeal parallel import rules in Australia, a decision that will significantly impact the Australian book industry. But there is every chance that we will stray onto things like fair use and other topics, so beware. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our panellists this afternoon. Garth Nix. Garth was born in... Sorry, Garth, your age is in here. I hope you're happy for me to go with that.
You're about to read my Wikipedia entry, I was
Garth was born in 1963 in Melbourne, Australia. A full-time writer since 2001, he previously worked as a literary agent, marketing consultant, book editor, book publicist, book sales representative, bookseller, and as a part-time soldier in the Australian Army Reserve. Garth's books include the award-winning young adult fantasy novels Sabriel, Lyriel, Abhorsen, and Clariel. More than 5 million copies of his books have been sold around the world, and his books have appeared on the bestseller list of the New York Times, Publishers Weekly, The Guardian, The Australian, and his work has been translated into 40 languages. Welcome, Garth.
Thank you.
Phillipa McGuinness is Executive Publisher at New South Publishing in Sydney. She's editor of the book Copyfight and is writing a history of the year 2001 that will be published by Random House in 2018. Welcome, Pat. Nikki Gemmell is a columnist... Trust me. More than my career's worth as your publisher, I suspect. Nikki Gemmell is columnist for the Weekend Australian magazine and the best-selling author of 13 novels, including the international bestseller The Bride Strip Bear and 4 works of non-fiction. Her books have been translated in 22 languages, and in early 2017, HarperCollins will publish After, a fiercely brave, poignant, and powerful memoir which Nikki is writing in an attempt to understand the death of choice of her mother, Elaine Gemmell. Welcome, Nikki. And last but certainly not least, Michael Robotham. Michael's novels have been translated into 23 languages. He is twice winner of the Ned Kelly Award for Australia's Crime Novel of the Year and has twice been shortlisted for the UK Crime Writers Association Steel Dagger, for the Night Ferry and Shatter, and twice for the CWA's acclaimed Golden Dagger Award for Say You're Sorry and Life or Death. Welcome, Michael. So this is something of a spoiler alert. With 3 authors and 2 publishers on the panel, you're not going to be surprised to learn that we're in favour of fighting for Australian stories. So much of our job today, I think, is about explaining what is quite a complex issue and throwing light on the arguments on both sides. But before we start, I'm just interested in canvassing a show of hands from the audience on today's topic. So if you think Australian stories are worth fighting for, please raise your hand. Okay, good. It seems like a friendly audience. Now for the nerve-wracking moment. If you're not for fighting for Australian stories, please raise your hand. Okay, so I think we can probably all go home. Which is great. But you can put your hand up if you're just here for a bit of a rest. Okay, all right. All right, thank you. So the way we're going to run this is we're going to talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll come to the floor for questions. And at the end of the event, and only if you're still in favour of defending Australian stories, then Garth, Phillipa, Nikki and Michael will sign copies of their work. So we will need to take a show of hands again at the end. Right, I think we need to start at the beginning with some fundamentals. So first up, Phillipa, what is copyright?
Okay, that sounds like a really difficult question, but in fact it's not. It's a very simple concept, and quite often I joke, some of you may have heard me make this joke before, that people hear the word copyright the way we hear words like superannuation or infrastructure, and you think, oh, so boring, but it is a crucially fundamental, and as I say, a simple concept that is basically a form of codified respect. It's as simple as that, codified respect. And so rest assured, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not going to talk about the Copyright Act of 1968. I'm just going to say that what copyright does automatically is give a creator the right to control his or her work. So if you write a poem, a song, a novel, if you paint, you own the intellectual property in that work. Now, you might decide that you want to give it away. You're going to put your song on SoundCloud and you don't care who downloads it and shares it, and if it ends up being used on an ad for Subaru, you don't mind. You want it out there. On the other hand, you might write a poem or a novel and think, this is how I'm going to make my living. I would like to be reimbursed for my work, for my creative effort. Copyright makes that possible.
Michael, let's go a bit deeper. So what is territorial copyright?
Territorial copyright basically means that if you own the rights to something, be it, as Pepper said there, a poem or a song or a book, you can sell those rights in Australia, and you can sell those rights in America or in the UK. The world basically is divided up into territories, and it's the same reason that, you know, certain products here, people are licensed to actually, you know, sell certain cars in this country, you know, or sell, you know, certain, you know, retail goods and whatnot. Territorial copyright basically protects your rights in certain territories, and it means that you can't have someone that simply ignores a territory and sells or sends your book or publishes your book without giving you any sort of reimbursement, giving you anything at all, just decides to steal your copyright and sell it in another territory.
So we've got copyright, which is the right of the creator to decide what to do with their work, and then we've got territorial copyright, which basically protects it in a particular territory as the creator chooses to. So Nikki, what is the term of copyright? What is the term of copyright?
Oh, you mean for authors now?
Yeah, for authors. What is the term of copyright?
For authors now, we feel protected because we have a 70 years, isn't it?
70 years after death.
After death, that our work is under our copyright. And in terms of the Productivity Commission and this report, this interim report that has been developed by a group of accountants, they, in a kind of fudged way, suggested that perhaps it would be good if Australian writers had that term of 70 years reduced to between 15 and 25 years, which means for all of them,
and from creation.
From creation rather than from
Yeah.
death, which means for us as writers, I've been a freelancer as a writer ever since I became a full-time novelist, which was 20 years ago. That means a lot of us don't have superannuation. A lot of us think, what is our future in terms of providing for our children, all the rest of it? We live the precarious life of an artist. Our royalties, we rely on those. For someone like me, I published a book called The Bride Strip Bare. Now, if this new proposal came in, I would no longer get royalties, or in a very few years, I would just lose all my royalties on that book. Anyone would be free to make a movie of that book, or a mini-series, and I would not get paid for that. Books that we all adore as Australians, that go to the heart of who we are, our national psyche, like Possum Magic, Diary of a Wombat, Cloud Street, all those authors still living would lose that income on their books. So for us as writers, we feel like proposals like this are a tragedy in terms of the national conversation, because it's going to reduce the voices out there and the Australian stories out there.
So I want to talk in detail in a minute about what the Productivity Commission have actually put in their draft report. So they talk about, they don't actually say that they propose to change the term of copyright. But they do say that in their report that there's a finding that the term of copyright, in their opinion, is too long as it currently is. Of course, you know, if you buy something, you buy a car, you buy a table, and you've owned it for 15 years, the idea that in 15 years' time somebody's going to come and take it away from you, I'm sure most of you find kind of, frankly, slightly repelling. And if you've been writing for longer than 15 years, then it means that you effectively would no longer own the rights to the income from your work, which is a bit of a shame when you're still going.
Yes.
It's probably worth pointing out, James, that they did backtrack from this.
Yes.
In a very weaselly fashion. You know, when there was an enormous uproar, because this is an absolutely insane idea to have, you know, a 15-year period of copyright from creation, and it's completely at odds with how things work around the world, and it's also against various international agreements and so on. And so they came out and said, we didn't mean that actually. We didn't mean it. And when I went to the Productivity Commission's hearing, and I said, why, if you didn't mean it? Later on, they came out with a press release later saying, we didn't really mean it. You know, it's not a recommendation. I said, yes, but there's 2 pages of the thing, and there's a draft finding in a box that says this is what it should be. Why is it there if you don't mean it? And they didn't answer me. They said, oh no, well we've resolved from that. And I think that's one of the things about the whole Productivity Commission report, is that those 2 pages actually showed their basic contempt for Australian authors, for creators of all kinds, that they thought, this is a good idea, we're going to put it in anyway, even though we know it's entirely impractical. It actually showed, I guess, the beginning of their thinking, which was that, you know, authors don't matter, creators don't matter, you know, it's all about consumers, and people should have what they want sooner rather than later, and not pay for it. But, you know, coming back to that, you know, if you make a table or a chair or you create anything, I mean, if I built a house and 15 years later someone came along and said, I'll have that. Oh yeah, 15 years, yeah, it's yours now.
Yeah.
I think, and they took their argument seemed to be that they thought when books are published that they make all their money in the first sort of 6 months, or and yet, you know, every writer will tell you that when you write a book, it's a bit like buying a lottery ticket. You sort of hope that maybe it might actually come up and the balls will drop in your favour. And that might not necessarily be next Wednesday. I mean, there is so many celebrated cases of books that long after they were published finally get made into a film or get discovered and become massive, you know, massively important books culturally, and yet they're basically arguing that that doesn't matter. So every time, if you're a writer, you know, the idea that everyone else can make money out of your work, but you can't.
I also asked about the methodology of how did they work out that most books only make their money, you know, in the first 3 months of their life, to which again there was no answer, because there was no methodology. You know, there was no way of working this out. Exactly. You know, books come back in multiple editions. Sometimes a book does nothing in its first release. 20 years later, you know, it gets picked up. The author keeps writing. Their new books become huge, or the old books come back. So, I mean, there's a very disturbing part of this whole report was the complete lack of knowledge of how the industry works, and apparently disinclination to find out as well.
Yes. So we'll come on to what the report actually said in just a moment. It's fair to say they did resolve from that point after the report was published. Now, Garth, I do want to ask you the tricky question, the really tricky question, which is at the heart of this. What are parallel import rules? Because they sound really, really sexy and really easy to understand. What actually are they? How do they work?
I think one of the important things about this report and about the whole discussion, and people talk about parallel importation restrictions, and as if they sound like sort of minor regulations, like they're not very important. You can just change them, and you know, nothing much will happen. But really, I prefer to talk about parallel importation restrictions. Removing them actually means giving up Australian territorial sovereignty over intellectual property. It's actually giving up a very real Australian territory. And it's a territory of the mind, it's a territory of copyright. And parallel importation restrictions basically mean that if a book is published, as Michael said, you sell the rights to your book to be published in Australia, maybe in America and the United Kingdom as well. And those books can be published in those countries, and those editions can be sold in those territories, and they can't be sold in the other territories. And parallel importation restrictions are not some bolted-on thing that's been added to copyright. It's an integral part of copyright. It's an integral part of how territorial copyright works around the world. So in America, and I brought some visual aids to demonstrate this, which happen to be my own book, which could be handy. Thanks, Michael. I think I was hoping for a table or something, to make this easier. But, okay, here's one of my books, Claro, published in Australia a couple of years ago by an independent Australian publisher, Allen and Unwin. So, published here, printed here, sold here. Okay, thank you, Michael. The book was also published at the same time in the United Kingdom, and that's the book there. And at the same time, thank you. And at the same time,
this is a wonderful piece of advertising. All these other authors holding Garth Nix's books. This isn't really a topic of discussion about.
And I must admit, I think perhaps I should have chosen some sort of third-party book, but I didn't have 3 separate editions. So, and this is the American books, all published at the same time in their different territories. Now, the American book, as things stand at the moment, the American book is sold in the United States, and that American publisher is absolutely secure. These editions cannot come into America and be sold there. So the American publisher has their secure territory in America. The British publisher has their secure territory in the United Kingdom and various parts of the old British Commonwealth. Absolutely secure. At the moment, the Australian publisher, Allen and Unwin, an independent, also has this secure territory. It exists, it's a real thing. Now what the proposed changes are, is that by the removal of parallel importation restrictions, this book can come into Australia in bulk, and I should say at the moment any individual can buy any individual books from anywhere they want. That's not going to change. But it means that this American book can come in to Australia, this British book can come into Australia and compete with this Australian book. This Australian edition cannot go to America, it cannot go to the United Kingdom. So from having 3 separate territories which have their own publishing rights and the books are secure and the publishers have the knowledge they can use those books and they'll be secure in their territory, all of a sudden Australia is no longer part of that group. Australia becomes a completely separate open territory where any legitimate edition from anywhere can be brought in and sold in bulk. So the Australian publisher has got nothing to invest in. They have no security. Why would an Australian publisher invest in publishing an Australian book when they know that they'll be competing with American books and British books in bulk of that same edition? So they stop investing in the books because anything successful is going to have a British and American edition. So success is just creating competition for the Australian publisher. So why would they invest in it? How can they keep going? And of course the other thing is just the basic economics of books, which is that books don't make much money. You need some books to make money to help pay for all the other books. If your most successful books are always going to be competing with American and British editions, so you've got this extra competition and you can't compete with them. Your books as a publisher, an Australian publisher, cannot go to America or the United Kingdom. How do you compete? It's not a level playing field, it's a sunken pit, where the Americans and the British can rain down whatever editions they want and we cannot respond.
So I just want to clarify how the specifics of the rules. So I think the Copyright Amendment Act in 1991 basically said that if a book was published in English language overseas, then it should be published in Australia within 30 days. If it's published within 30 days, copyright is established in Australia and bulk copies can't be brought in. But any individual is free to order any book from anywhere in the world for their personal individual use. So PIRs, as they're called, parallel import rules, are only about stopping commercial quantities of books being brought into Australia once copyright has been established.
I just want to say, the other thing is, I mean, where Garth mentioned, you know, you're very fortunate as a writer to get published in America and the UK and to have these other territories. And you sort of think, well, you know, if you're already that successful, why does it matter? But the reason it matters is that if publishers rely on technically relatively a handful of books to make enough money to then be able to spend and invest in new Australian writers, new voices, the next Tim Winton, the next Geraldine Brooks. If you take away, if you make their business so risky that they cannot make money on authors like Garth or Nikki or myself, if suddenly they're competing against American and UK publishers that are flooding our market with copies of our books, the publishers are not going to have the funds to be able to publish the next generation of Australian storytellers. And this is what we mean, the whole book is called Save Oz Stories. It's about saving uniquely Australian stories and the next generation of Australian writers.
So that's the book that you've got in your bags here, which has been produced by the book industry, is being distributed free around the country. Lots of great contributions from lots of different authors, all writing on the same subject. And in a true celebration of creativity, what is best about this book is that every author tackles it in a completely unique and different way. So it's enormously good fun to compare.
Can I just add something very quickly, Garth, in terms of these 3 editions that we've just seen? I know Michael has said the same before, and I found this too, with various editions in various countries. In the future, if some of our editions, like a US edition or a UK edition, floods our local Australian market, what overseas publishers often do is change words for their local market. So for me, with a book like Cleve, which was set in the Central Australian desert, I had my American publishers change the word ute to pickup. I had them change the word stroller to pushchair, and in fact they even changed the title because they said that American audiences wouldn't understand what the word cleave means, which was central to the whole book, and so they changed it to Alice Springs. So basically my novel ended up in America in the travel section, in the Australian tourist travel section. But that would have come under these proposals, that would have come into the Australian market competing with the local edition.
Technically, you could see a future where on the same bookshelf in the same bookstore you have the same book, but a UK version, an Australian version, and a US version. And as Nikki says, the US version will have all American spellings. It will have, I mean, I have added extra chapters for my American readers because they want everything tied up so neatly in, you know, and don't want to sort of let the reader do too much work. But yeah.
What are you really saying then, Mike?
Well, actually, it's terrible. If there are any Americans here, I apologise. I actually had an American publisher say to me, American readers aren't as intelligent as UK and Australian readers, and therefore we have to take out the psychological references, which is appalling, and that's completely untrue. But, I mean, if you're going to treat them as though they're less intelligent, then they're going to become less intelligent. No, this is one of these great issues which goes beyond pricing and cost and everything else. But do we really want to create a situation where our children at school, you know, are reading nothing but American-based stories?
Yeah, so I want to come on to the impacts and talk about what the changes will mean for readers, booksellers, publishers and authors in a moment. But before we leave, as it were, the introduction part of the talk, I do just want to tackle one other tricky term which has been bandied around a great deal in recent times: fair use, PIP. Can you do us the 2-minute version of what fair use is and how it compares to the current Australian code of practice, which is fair dealing?
I'm happy to do that. So the productivity, their draft report made 3 recommendations. We've heard about 2 of them. One is PIRs. I guess you all remember what that acronym stands for. But there won't be a test at the end. The other one was the term of copyright, which is an area, you know, as we've discussed, that made a lot of creators very angry. the flip side of that is that a lot of people on what we might call the copy left get equally outraged by the length of copyright, but that is a separate discussion. The third thing they recommended was fair use, and fair use is a term that sounds benign. It sounds lovely, really. What could be wrong with fair use? It must be fair. And I think one of the best ways of illustrating it is by recounting an anecdote that I heard at a copyright conference. I actually went to a few copyright conferences when I was researching my book. And a big, brash American lawyer, a New York lawyer who'd worked on a number of extremely high-profile cases in the US with lots of big publishing houses and movie houses, music companies, artists. He'd made a lot of money out of arguing about fair use in court. And he looked around, he'd just landed in the country, and he said, "So you guys are going to introduce fair use here?" And he laughed and he said, "It's fantastic for lawyers." And I think that says a lot. You know, a lot of the lawyers in the room probably were pleased and relieved. Some of the copyright academics thought, yeah, it's going to make everything more straightforward. But a lot of us who work in publishing, whether as publishers or writers or in any of the creative fields, would have read enough about fair use to know that it's less clear than many of its proponents argue. So in the current legislation here, there's a thing called fair dealing. And what that means is that if you use a small amount of a work, say a poem or an extract from a novel, in your essay, or as a form of criticism, if you're writing a review in one of the papers, if you are using a work as part of a parody or a satire, or if you're reporting it in the news, that's all fine under the existing fair dealing legislation that we have. Fair use is different. It goes beyond that. And what it means, particularly in the educational context, is that a lot of work can be used for free. So creators don't get reimbursed. They say, no, we can take this chapter from your book. We want to use it as part of an anthology. We think that falls under fair use. And perhaps the publisher will say, well, we disagree. We're going to take it to court because the legislation isn't as clear as it might be. It doesn't have one of the key legal components of fair use is a transformative effect, which is where you take one thing and you turn it into something else. So you have a song, perhaps an extremely well-known riff from something, and you say, no, but I put it in my song. I made it something else. And the artist might be saying, well, it still sounds like my song to me, and you used it without asking my permission. So fair use is much murkier than its proponents suggest. And when I read the key parts of the Productivity Commission's report about fair use, and they're presenting it as if it's some kind of utopia where everything will be clear and free, I just found that ridiculous because it's part of an American legal culture which is completely different to what we know here. They don't have fair use in the UK or Europe.
So clear and free, but a lawyer's picnic. A lawyer's picnic.
And extremely detrimental to creators of all types, but particularly educational publishers. So a number of very well-informed people refer to the Canadian experience, and in some ways I think Canada is comparable to us. They're a smaller country with, a very big neighbour who can dominate their publishing field. And that means that, for example, school books written for Canadian students are extremely important. They want to learn their own history or their own culture, their own literature. A number of very big Canadian publishers, for example, the educational arm of Oxford University Press in Canada, they don't exist anymore ever since this provision was introduced in their legislation. Nelson, another big publisher, they don't exist. cost. So there are real costs, and I don't think that many people, whether they're in the Productivity Commission or elsewhere, have really thought of the cost of fair use.
I think, James, maybe you could, for those people that aren't over the issue, because I'm sure they're sitting here thinking, well, hold on, why could they possibly be considering this? And at least I suppose you've got to, I think, tell people though, the reason with the fair use thing, the assumption the Productivity Commission are making are that with greater access to all this material, that other creative people can create songs or books or poems, and they can pick and choose from and do it, and they think that it actually increases innovation, that it increases creativity, and that's their argument, whereas we're obviously arguing something.
So let's come to exactly that point. But first of all, I just want to back up and just give everybody the timetable of what's actually happened so far. I mean, I should just say that this debate is, particularly around PIR, has been going on for the best part of 30 years, and a number of the authors here have been involved in this conversation for some time. The move to bring in a US-style fair use piece of legislation is pretty new, though. But just to give you the kind of recent history, so back in March 2015, the Harper Review, I should say nothing to do with Harper Collins, Professor Harper, recommended the government task the Productivity Commission with what they called an overarching review of intellectual property and amend the laws to allow parallel imports. And then in August 2015, the government requested the Productivity Commission review Australia's intellectual property arrangements, and parallel import rules were included in the terms of reference. And then, in November 2015, the Treasurer announced that the government supported the allowing of parallel import of books and would progress the recommendation after the PC's final report. So even before the PC had reported, the government was saying they were going to do this. And that's the first time, I think, in 30 years when the government have actually supported the introduction of PIRs. And then in April of this year, the Productivity Commission issued their draft report, and their final report is due in September. But in their draft report, they found that the term of copyright was too long, and this is where the 15 years was talked about as a potential solution. They absolutely said that they should repeal parallel import rules, and they recommended that US-style fair use was introduced. Now, the key question that we need to get to here is, why do the Productivity Commission think this is a good idea? And I want to go to Garth, because Garth, I think you've been involved in this possibly longer than anybody else.
It's a very good question, and one that I really cannot answer why they would think this is a good idea, except from my perception, which is that it derives from a neoliberal philosophy that all markets should be free, and then a sort of willful ignorance of how the publishing market actually works. One of the most important things, of course, is that the Australian market is a subset of a world market. And as I've talked about earlier, the United States has its territorial copyright, the United Kingdom has its territorial copyright. We have a modified territorial copyright, as James has mentioned, in 1991. We made certain changes to make books more available, to make pricing more competitive, and so on. Those things were done. So we already modified it to make it better, make it work better for our small market. The Productivity Commission, as far as I can tell, is driven solely by the idea that if a freed market, even if it's part of a much greater non-free market, must simply be better. And the report doesn't really support this. It cites various inquiries into book pricing, and it looks at, really the whole thing looks at book pricing compared at different historical times, which really mostly has to do with the exchange rate and the value of the Australian dollar. The dollar's movements, really govern that side of things. So it looks at pricing on one side, and it doesn't look at the cost on the other side. As Pip said, there are huge costs, there are huge unintended consequences from these proposed changes, which are not addressed. I asked them
and let's come to that in a second. But first of all, I mean, what they're fundamentally saying is they think that cheaper books, more readily available, is a good thing.
They think They think that basically an open market will lead to cheaper books, and cheaper books, regardless of whether that's a good book or a bad book, the mere fact that it's cheaper will mean that that benefits Australian culture, benefits the economy, benefits everyone.
Yes.
They treat a book like a sweatshop t-shirt.
Which is curious, and in fact, one of the commissioners said to me, well, what is the difference between a book and any other product?
Yeah. So what is wrong? What is wrong with the idea of cheaper books more readily available for more people?
Well, the basic problem is that there won't necessarily be cheaper books, and that is one very, very key problem, in that they're suggesting a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Books would not necessarily become cheaper. Books are already, availability of books I don't think has been an issue for many, many years for all kinds of reasons. Market pressures, just the awareness of books, through a very connected world. People know when books are available in the US and the UK. And if they're not available here, then publishers and booksellers already would suffer. So you don't need an additional force to make them more available. But I think the greatest problem is that you have a dubious benefit. They hold up this thing, okay, the benefit will be cheaper books and that will make everything better. But there probably wouldn't be cheaper books. There might be some cheaper books, there might not, that's true, there might be some. And it might only be for a brief period of time, it depends on many other factors. So you've got this dubious benefit, and then you have the massive costs. The costs to Australian publishers going out of business, Australian publishers no longer being able to offer opportunities for Australian authors to be published, so we lose all those Australian voices, we use uniquely Australian books. Booksellers, I think, also would be, and booksellers, some booksellers have gone two ways on this. They think it would help them. I personally think they're very mistaken. It would also open them up to greater competition from incredibly powerful monoliths. Amazon, for example, it would present them with many, many more opportunities to be here and sell American books to us. There's so many costs, so many costs that have just not been looked at.
Well, I want to talk about that a little bit more. Pip, specifically for publishers, what would be the cost to publishers of repealing PIRs? What would happen with publishers?
I think there would be less incentive, as many of my friends here have said, for publishers to invest in an author, whether that author was in Australia or to invest in buying the rights for an overseas author and building them in Australia. You would know, James, there are many, many books that we're offered all the time from local authors, from overseas agents and publishers. And you make a decision basically about where you're going to put your time and your money, what you're going to invest in. If I thought that a book that I published here or bought from overseas was going to be undercut on every front because we could not guarantee the territorial copyright, why would I do it? I don't want to send my employer broke. There would be much less incentive for us to support books and writers.
So what is the impact of that then, Nikki, on authors? What happens if publishers reduce their investment? And I think let's look at a mid-long term time frame here.
Well, I think you can look to New Zealand as an example of what's happened, because New Zealand is one of the few countries in the world that has allowed this to happen. America and the UK wouldn't dream of doing this. They want to protect their local stories, their local voices. So in New Zealand, the result has been the local industry has been decimated. Money has gone offshore to big publishers. Small, independent, local publishers have either had to fold, or their lists, which is how many books they publish every year, have been dramatically reduced. And the fallout from that, sadly, has been that they're less willing to take a punt on new, exciting authors, on different voices, on voices that they think, oh, look, it's almost there, but in the past we might have given them 5 or 6 books to get underway, to get that really big bestseller going. Those kind of voices are being silenced. So it's a real tragedy in terms of what has happened to the New Zealand book industry. And I really, really hope that this doesn't happen in Australia, which has a flourishing industry of independent publishers, of independent booksellers, of a real plethora of voices that are exciting and dynamic, and all that will be reduced and flattened and diminished if this goes
more
ahead.
importantly, I should say, in New Zealand, is going back to what Garth said, the idea it was going to lead to cheaper books and more diversity, more books. New Zealand has seen its almost expensive books imaginable and fewer books available. So it's had completely the opposite effect of what they claim would happen.
And a lot, and far fewer New Zealand books. Which is it's a tragedy in your own country to have, you decimate your own publishing industry and you end up with fewer books written by your own people.
But I just want to clarify one point there. I mean, cheaper books more readily available is something that we are all for, right? We don't have a problem with that concept if we can make it work. If we can make it work, because I think the key question is, are books more expensive in Australia than compared to other parts of the world? And if they are more expensive, why are they more expensive?
Well, again, personally, from my point of view, I did this before I gave evidence to the Productivity Commission, looked at my titles around the world, and my copies of my books in Australia were cheaper than anywhere else in the world, and that included the UK. This is, I took a backlist title rather than the new one. My backlist was cheaper in Australia than anywhere else. Now, saying that, if we went back to 2009, or when the Australian dollar was at its height, the opposite was true. And I think this is one of the great issues. The Productivity Commission have based their findings upon figures that are so out of date when it comes to the cost of books in Australia. Whereas now, because the Australian dollar has fallen in value, what we pay for a book here is comparable to what you pay anywhere in the world. You can get, particularly when you're looking at, we get heavily discounting here as well in certain places. We have options to get those books. And no matter what we say here, nothing will ever change the fact that if you think a book is too expensive here, you can go online and order it. That's never going to change. That's the case now, and it will always be the case in the future. None of these changes will ever stop you being able to do that.
I think one of the other changes that's worth mentioning, which I'm sure everybody is aware of, is since 2008, 2009, the world has become a global marketplace, right? Everything is available and all prices are visible in a way that simply wasn't there before. And I think, that is brought about pressure on publishers locally to do the right thing in terms of price and availability.
Yeah, I think, publishers are always looking at the price of the same book overseas, whether it's, on Amazon or elsewhere. And we have to match or beat that price, or we know that, our customers will buy around us. So it's an absolutely fundamental principle. And as Michael says, the data that the Productivity Commission has been drawing on is from 2009. And the Australian Bureau of Statistics, I think, the ABS is on everyone's mind this week more than at any other point in history. But they gave up sampling the publishing industry. So we don't have good data, which is especially frustrating when the Productivity Commission is using evidence, or it says it's using evidence that, we as publishers and authors and booksellers know is well out of date and not accurate. It's very frustrating and not helpful at all.
Pip, I want to ask you one other question about this, and particularly about the global marketplace, because it pertains to the idea that, in a digital world, we have instant access to everything. We can get everything anytime. We can download it. We can share. There's a sense that as an industry, are we just not recognizing that the world has changed? Why is there this or what I should really say is, who is behind the push to make everything free and instantly available? Who actually wants that to happen? I can see that obviously consumers have an interest in that, but who is really driving that agenda?
I think, in a way, we're all driving it ourselves. We have the sense that if something is available, we need to watch it now. People on the other side of the world are watching Game of Thrones. We need to watch it right now. We want that book. So there's a culture of speed that has come along with the digital age. And thanks to big tech, you know, the big players like Google and Amazon and Apple, and I have left some Facebook, you know, the really, you know, the Google is now the most powerful company in the world. Never forget that. And part of me thinks, what a great time to be alive. You know, there's all this possibility. We have access to more information than ever before. There's more choice. It's wonderful. It's exciting. We also need to remember that there's a cost. We've talked about costs, you know, at various points through our discussion this afternoon. It's in Google's interests for everything to be free because they're making unbelievable amounts of money, like truly unbelievable amounts of money through advertising. So if you look at, say, journalism, that you know, thought that they would make the transition from the print world to the digital world by going online and getting their journalists to upload videos and making sure that their journalists filed faster so they could be part of this very rapid digital world. And of course they would sell digital advertising. It has not panned out like that. I think something like 3/4 of all the digital advertising revenue in the world is going to Google and Facebook, not to Fairfax or the New York Times or the companies investing in journalism and editors and photographers and distribution. They're not getting that revenue. Google is getting the revenue. So it is very complicated because if somebody here thinks, oh, I love this obscure author nobody has ever heard about, you can get a copy of that book through Amazon easily if your local bookseller doesn't have it. What a great time to be alive. It's wonderful. But then you think, what about this ecosystem? We're sitting, all of us today, right now, in the kind of hub of the very fragile and complicated literary ecosystem that involves publishers and authors and writers and booksellers and book buyers and readers. It's fragile and it's very precious, and I don't think we should, you know, lose it by saying, no, big tech, they say everything should be free, they say that fair use is the way to go, let's do that. They have their own very clear vested interests.
So there's a real conflict between the reformers on one side and the creators on the other. So I'm very conscious of time. Is there a happy medium that exists?
Yeah, it's called copyright. You know, it works. You know, we have a system that works.
And PIR works. And I think, but the other thing that we haven't touched on, I know this is the Productivity Commission, it was a long report, but the other thing they suggested, they actually said in its draft recommendations, they accepted that Australian publishing would shrink if this came in. And they accepted that authors' incomes, which are already the average Australian author, is $11,000 or $12,000 a year is the average earnings of Australian author. They accepted that that would shrink, okay? But they then said, but that's okay because Arts Council funding should be increased. I think, yes, we've all seen what's happened to Arts Council funding over the last year. It actually argued that the most efficient way to do it would be to have an open market and to have the government directly pay writers. It's an insane suggestion.
I mean, it's totally bizarre because on one side you have this neoliberal super capitalist, you know, all markets must be free, and on the other side it's like something from the Soviet Union in the 40s where this favoured writer will be given a nice dasher in the country, but you won't. You know, who decides? How do they decide who gets supported? This writer is going to get funding, that writer won't get funding. Now, all writers want is actually to have the same foundation of copyright and the possibilities that exist from that American authors enjoy and British authors enjoy, and it is a system that is proven to work and work extremely well. And one of the submissions, which I think was from Scribe Publications to the Productivity Commission, they described it as a draconian solution for a problem that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
You know, they're actually looking to apply an ideological solution for something which is not a problem.
So before we throw open to questions from the floor, I just want to ask each of our panelists to kind of, answer one and the same question, which is really the kind of question that we began with, which is why are Australian stories worth fighting for? Because we are obviously looking at a potential change that will damage the ecology of the industry. And what the industry is saying is that will have an impact on publishers and authors, and there'll be less Australian stories. But what we need to understand is why Australian stories actually matter in a global marketplace. Why aren't US, UK, other countries' stories just as relevant, just as important? Why do Australian stories matter? So we'll start at this end, and we'll just work down the line.
Well, straight away, it's a bit like earlier you made the point, is cheaper books. I mean, surely that's the aim of everything. Well, it depends on what the book is. If it's cheaper, airport novels written out of America about America, maybe the fact that it's cheap might not be necessarily what you want. I mean, Australian stories matter because this whole fight is about, the same reason that we have rules that govern Australian content on TV and that we support our local film industry is we want to see Australian stories told. We want to see Australians children growing up, reading Australian stories, reading Australian histories, reading about their country. Australian stories don't just unite us, they introduce us to the world, they allow us to relate to the past, Australians of the past, they allow us to relate to people from overseas to relate to Australia. Australian stories are vital to our culture. If we lose Australian stories, Australian storytellers, well, basically it's like, let's just turn ourselves into a McDonald's and just leave it at that.
Garth, anything you want to add to that, or any suggested compromises?
No, I completely agree. I think books are really part of a nation's soul, and if you take them away and you don't create new ones, books they reflect society. They inform us. They explain things. Books can change how a whole nation thinks. Books are incredibly important. They've always been incredibly important through history. And a country that decides it doesn't want to support its own books and its own authors, what kind of country is that? Some people say you get the government you deserve, which is a very sad thing. If we get the publishing industry that the Productivity Commission suggests we ought to have, it'll be a very sad country indeed.
Nikki?
Pete Fitzsimons, he had a lovely analogy. He said, we as Australians, we love telling stories traditionally around the campfire. And we have to imagine that campfire will gradually die down if these proposals go through. And for me, Pete, you were saying, we all have our obscure authors out there that we just adore, that hardly anyone's heard of, but we passionately love and follow and want to keep buying their books. Those kind of authors will be the first ones to disappear because publishers will not be able to take a punt on them. And that whole beautiful element of risk within the Australian publishing industry that has nurtured some of our classic books that we all hold in our hearts, that sense of risk will disappear. And I think that's a national tragedy.
Yep.
I publish a lot of Australian history. I like reading it. I'm writing a kind of a contemporary history myself. And when I look at the kind of histories that were published about this country in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, you can almost count them on one hand. There are some really major books that are very well known, and you think, well, there must be more. And there aren't more, because we didn't have that kind of culture in the 40s and the 50s. We didn't have a culture where historians felt that their own stories, the history of Australia, was important. People weren't taught Australian history at school. They learned about the history of the British Empire. They did not learn about the history of their own country. Now, you just need to walk through the shelves of Kinokuniya. You will see hundreds of Australian history books, that you would like to read because they'll tell you something about your country. That's why Australian stories are important.
Thank you, panellists. I think we've probably just got time for one or two questions if anybody's got a question out there. As some of you might be able to tell, I'm a POM. I've been living in Australia for 8 years, forgive me, but I worked in the British publishing industry for 15 years. The irony for me of this debate is that the Australian publishing, writing, book-selling industry is so much healthier than the UK. And it is the envy of the English language markets in America and Britain. So the idea that we may face change to decimate that seems totally counterintuitive. Now, do we have any questions? Yes, gentleman in the blue shirt.
You mentioned Google as being one of the big red horses that are constantly pushing this. What about trade agreements? Is that a big part of this as well?
So the question is, Google are pushing this agenda, are trade agreements pushing this agenda?
Yeah, it's not just Google, it's the world we're in. You know, it's easy to demonise Google. They've seen an opportunity. They also happen to be about the biggest proponent though of fair use, and that's no coincidence. Yeah, trade agreements are what mean that the term of copyright went from 50 years to 70 years. That was part of the free trade agreement that we signed with the US. It was not discussed in Parliament at all, I don't think. So it is sometimes easy to get quite conspiratorial about, and I'm not suggesting that's what you're doing, but a lot of people do get quite conspiratorial about it and say, oh, it's all a big conspiracy cooked up by Disney or whoever. It's not. You know, there are very sound reasons why the term of copyright is what it is. One of the advantages of trade agreements is that there is absolutely no way known that the term of copyright could be reduced to 15 or 20 years, as the Productivity Commission was suggesting. But as I think Garth said, what was alarming about that was the disdain with which they were clearly treating creators of all stripes.
Yeah, they dedicated several pages arguing for something that they knew they couldn't change. Interesting tactic. Yes, lady over there.
I was a victim of the speculative invoicing in the UK by Davenport Lyons and Topware Interactive. I know if you want to see me afterwards, I'd be really happy to talk to you. 2 years of being in court with those horrors. So the idea of fair use, can you go a little bit more into detail about it? Because I try and tell people here in Australia and they just glaze over. They don't realise that it could happen to them.
So I'm not a lawyer, but I take it that you were being accused of downloading illegally.
Didn't.
Yeah, well I guess the point to be made is that it is very murky, and it can be manipulated by different parties in very negative ways that do very little to protect the rights of individual creators, and clearly in this case consumers as well.
And in particular at the moment, fair dealing is actually very tightly defined,
yes.
Which is why it works, and fair use isn't, which is where you get murky areas and people get into all
that was one of the main things that came up in the hearings of the Productivity Commission, is that fair dealing, prescribes what is fair dealing, and fair use doesn't. It just says it has to be tested. And one of the things that arose, and I wasn't aware of this, is that in order to test it, you'd actually have to go to the federal court. So if, for example, someone took 10 chapters out of one of my books and released them as a study guide by adding one line under each chapter and said that's fair use, I couldn't actually stop them unless I went to the federal court, which would cost a minimum of $25,000 just to get started. So, so there's no legislative control over it. It's just said, yeah, we'll see you in court. If you can't afford to go to court, which is the great majority of authors, and if publishers don't want to back it or also can't afford it, because publishing is not a giant, huge margin business. And I think that's the main problem of people people have is that, you know, fair dealing sets out what you can do. Fair use says, yeah, maybe you can do it. See you in court, which benefits the lawyers and people who want to do stuff and get away with it. You know, and is completely against the interests of creators and copyright owners.
Yeah, and I don't think even the most hardcore advocate of copyright as it is now would suggest that the system is 100% perfect. Of course, there is always room for some reform. I think that the reforms that were being proposed here are extremely regressive, as I think we've all made clear. The other thing is that often people say, well, the digital world has changed everything. No, it hasn't. The principles of copyright are exactly as they were in the analogue and the digital world. And fair use would make absolutely no difference with that.
Yes, and ebooks are only about 20% of the market. A lot of people make a comparison to the music market, but it's completely different in that 80% of the Australian book market is still a physical book market. Folks, I'm sorry, I think we've run out of time because we need to take one last vote, one last show of hands, otherwise Michael, Garth, Nikki and Pip won't sign books. So can you please raise your hand if you're in favour of fighting for Australian stories? Okay, great. Any dissenters? Thank you. Thank goodness for that. If you really want to show your support, please go to the Books Create website and sign the petition there. That's a petition that we're looking to hand into government at the end of this month at the Canberra Writers' Festival. Your support would be greatly appreciated. But in the meantime, thank you all for coming, and would you please show your appreciation to our panelists, Michael, Garth, Nikki, and